Hi everyone, and welcome to this session on sustainable peatlands, wet agriculture in action. I'm Sarah Johnson and I project manage the Lancashire Peatland Initiative for Lancashire Wildlife Trust, and I'll be chairing this session. So what do we mean by sustainable peatlands? What is wet agriculture, and is it the future for UK lowland peatlands? That's what we'll be exploring over the next 45 minutes. We'll be showing you a couple of videos of wetter farming that is currently being developed in the UK, and we'll also be joined by a panel of experts to discuss whether it's desirable or feasible on a larger scale. Before that, some brief housekeeping. As with the other sessions, please use the Q&A panel on the right-hand side of the screen to ask a question. I'll try to answer as many questions as I can, and any questions that don't get answered during the session will be shared with the panelists, and there'll be a chance to chat with us further during the exhibition space later on today at 6 p.m. So this picture you can see here is of Lancashire Wildlife Trust's Lowland Raised Bog Nature Reserve, Winmarleigh Moss, which is a site of special scientific interest and one of Lancashire's best examples of a lowland raised peat bog. Taken earlier this year, you can see that beautiful swathe of white cotton grass flowers, and if you walk across it, you'll see other characteristic bog species such as carpets or sphagnum, the vital building blocks of peat, which absorb carbon from the atmosphere. As we know, healthy wet peatlands can store huge amounts of carbon, as well as providing other benefits for wildlife and people. But protecting and restoring lowland raised bogs such as this is only one part of the solution to the management of our peatlands. The reality is that a vast majority of the rich peat soils in lowland areas in the UK have been drained either for grassland production or for agricultural fields. These lowland peat soils are strategically important for agriculture, and we depend on them for growing crops. But the irony here is that these peat soils were created precisely because they are wetlands, and wetlands are some of the most productive ecosystems on earth, but our agricultural system is based on drainage and drying out of peat. So it would seem that conventional agriculture based on drainage is unsustainable, and the drainage is the root cause of many problems associated with it, such as loss of biodiversity, decreasing water quality and storage, and greenhouse gas emissions. A report released in January by the Committee on Climate Change included a call for the large-scale restoration of at least 25% of lowland peat across the UK, across the country. And the impact of soil degradation also means it's not economically sustainable in the longer term due to the degradation and wasting of peat soils. Now, re-wetting helps us solve most of the problems caused by drainage, and this is what we are doing on sites we restore. However, restoration usually implies a stop or reduction in conventional drainage-based agriculture on peatlands. So wholesale restoration may not always be possible or desirable for farmers needing to make a living. So what's the solution? Is there another choice for farmers? Enter wet agriculture. Wet agriculture is essentially a wetter way of farming on peatlands that doesn't degrade the peat layer and can even add to peat accumulation. It's been touted as an inclusive solution that allows wet or re-wetted peatlands to remain productively used, and that doesn't require habitats to be drained. It's a potential opportunity to generate new business within UK agriculture, a sustainable land use option, instead of fighting to keep areas drained that would otherwise be wet. And there are a growing number of wet farming trials in the UK, and we will present now a couple of examples going on. The first video that we'll play now is Sphagnum Farming Rethought, which has been produced by BeadaMoss and Manchester Metropolitan University. Thanks.
Sphagnum Farming Rethought, a new take on sphagnum farming through an Innovate UK project to grow sphagnum moss as an economic agricultural crop. This is a former peat extraction site in Lancashire, and this is an agricultural grassland site in Leicestershire. They're both perfect sphagnum farming sites. 3D terrestrial laser scan images of a trial plot at the start of the project, and again 18 months later, show the great productivity and growth achieved through this project. After 2 to 3 years, the sphagnum is harvested, dried and processed until it looks like on the right, before being mixed with other growing media constituents such as bark, as on the left. It has similar advantageous properties to peat, so can replace it. This is approximately 1 meters cubed of sphagnum growing media, and 2 million is needed if it were to replace all UK peat. Sphagnum farming avoids peat extraction and so avoids this huge ecological and carbon store damage. Bare ex-extraction sites, drained peatland for grassland and arable uses release vast amounts of carbon each year. Carbon greenhouse gas measurements show that once there is a full coverage of sphagnum, it protects the carbon stored with negligible methane emissions. Therefore, further peat loss on these sites is prevented. The sphagnum growing media product was put to the test by peat-free partner Melcourt. Various commercial growers compared the product to other growing media available today. As you can see, it was a success. It worked just as well, if not better, than other commercially available growing medium. So, what's unique about this sphagnum farming project? The seeding material used is sustainably produced by BeadaMoss, the project lead. Tiny amounts of wild-sourced material is micropropagated, allowing large-scale material availability for sphagnum farming. It is clean, weed-free and does not damage peatland, and is all grown in a solar-powered facility. Beada Hummock and Beada Gel, two BeadaMoss products, were used in these trials as the seeding material. Irrigation systems were used to water the sphagnum from above, with no attempt to manage the water table. Different cover materials were tested on each site: uncovered mesh, perforated plastic and straw. And here's the same site a little while later. These pilots are being rolled into large-scale commercial trials through a new funded project. But to ensure the success of the future of sphagnum farming, initially some government support for land use conversion, early adopters, farmers and growers alike, more agricultural peatland awareness, and recognition of climate benefits of sphagnum farming are all needed. This Innovate UK funded project, led by BeadaMoss, with main partners Manchester Metropolitan University, University of East London, Melcourt and Natural England, has led to sphagnum farming to be rethought.
So that was Sphagnum Farming Rethought, which was produced by BeadaMoss and Manchester Metropolitan University. And it certainly gives us food for thought for the panel discussion. But before that discussion, we will now play our second video about a project that is using the sphagnum products produced by BeadaMoss, but for a different kind of wetter farming. The product of this farm is carbon. The Winmarleigh Carbon Farm is located on a former agricultural field right next to Lancashire Wildlife Trust's Winmarleigh Moss Nature Reserve, which you saw earlier. And as you see now in this video, the agricultural field has been re-wet and transformed into a pioneering carbon farm with the aim to store and capture carbon from the atmosphere. This is Winmarleigh Moss SSSI. And healthy peatlands such as this can store and absorb huge amounts of carbon from the atmosphere, making them a vital natural solution in the fight against climate change.
However, when they are drained or damaged in any way, that carbon gets released, contributing to greenhouse gas emissions.
Re-wetting of peatlands helps to solve most of the problems caused by drainage, and this is what we're doing on sites we restore. But restoration usually implies a stop or reduction in conventional agriculture, which may not always be possible for farmers needing to make a living. So what's the solution?
Welcome to Winmarleigh Carbon Farm. This area up until the 1970s was a lowland raised peat bog, then turned into agricultural land.
So on this carbon farm we're essentially planting a permanent cover crop of sphagnum moss to absorb and trap carbon in the ground.
So the first thing we did was strip the surface top layer off to remove all the nutrients.
has been put down over the sphagnum mosses to create a microclimate to help it while it establishes.
So the hydrology for the carbon farm is controlled by these big irrigation ditches which go the full length of the site, about 200 metres, and the water is controlled by the bulkhead that you see there, which controls the water level, and when it drops to a certain level below, the sump system, the pump in the sump pit there kicks in and feeds the water through the site. At the end of the site, where we let excess water go off, we've planted Phragmites, and the Phragmites has been planted to act as a filter for any nutrients or anything else going back into the water system. The other benefit of the Phragmites is that it can act as a nurse crop while the Sphagnum is getting established, giving the farmer a potential other income.
Over the next year, these tiny plugs of sphagnum will grow and cover the entire area. That will initially stop the area from releasing carbon like it is now, and then it will turn into that vital carbon store.
This collar has been put in by MMU to analyse greenhouse gas emissions from this peat soil, and we'll be studying that over the next 2 years.
We're hoping to demonstrate alternative sustainable wetland farming practices that can benefit people and wildlife, and that can be funded in the future through a blend of public and private finance.
We've created this farm-scale pilot so farmers and policymakers can see carbon farming in action, and to share lessons learned and showcase what can be achieved to go forwards in a much more sustainable way. We have the opportunity to do things differently, supporting incomes through a new wetter farming system whilst protecting our precious peatlands and restoring their crucial carbon storage capacity.
So that was a video about the Winmarleigh Carbon Farm, which, as you will see, I'm also involved with as part of the Care Peat project. We've just heard about 2 projects with differing aims, but both working with sphagnum moss that thrives under wet, boggy conditions. And these could potentially provide alternative wetter land use options. And carbon farming, keeping carbon in the ground, and sphagnum farming, growing a sphagnum crop on wet peatland, are of course not the same thing. Sphagnum farming, example of polluted culture, which is essentially an agriculture clear production goals, whereas carbon farming is perhaps seen as more of an intermediary between conservation and more intensive agriculture. So in the case of Winmarleigh, it's about planting a permanent non-harvested cover crop with a focus on ecosystem service provision such as carbon mitigation. However, both require the peat to be kept wet and need not be mutually exclusive. Both have benefits and could be side by side in the wider peatland landscape. So is this the future of land management on peat soils? Is it feasible or desirable at large scale across our lowland peatlands? Well, I'm very pleased to be joined by a panel of experts to discuss this. With us we have Tom Smart from Natural England. Tom is a lead author of the England Peat Strategy Greater Manchester Peat Pilot Report for Defra. We have with us Adam Briggs, who is the North West Environment Advisor for the National Farmers Union. We also have Jack Clough from the University of East London. Jack has been doing a PhD on polluted culture and wetter farming in the UK, and the University of East London is also a partner in the WaterWorks project, which is another project studying new wet farming techniques in the Great Fen. And we also have with us Dr. Chris Field, a senior lecturer in environmental ecology at Manchester Metropolitan University, and MMU are also a knowledge partner in both the carbon farm and sphagnum farming projects. And we also have Neal Wright from BeadaMoss with us as well. So they're our panel of experts for today. But before we dive into the discussion, I also first want to play a short interview with Catherine Dawson, the Technical Director of Melcourt Industries. Unfortunately, Catherine couldn't join the panel this afternoon, but she spoke earlier with Jacqueline Wright from BeadaMoss about the potential of sphagnum moss as a peat-free growing media.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our first panelist. Unfortunately, she could not be here in person, so please enjoy this pre-recorded video. If you have any questions at the end of hearing all the panelists speak, Neal Wright will be on the panel to answer those questions. Right, let's get started. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jackie Wright. I work at BeadaMoss, and I'm here this afternoon to speak to Catherine Dawson, who is the Technical Director at Melcourt. Catherine, could you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit more about you and the company?
Thanks, Jacqueline. Yes, as Jacqueline said, my name's Catherine Dawson. I work for Melcourt. I've worked in growing media, specifically peat-free growing media, for quite a long time now, probably more than 3 decades. Melcourt is a company that deals principally in forest co-products, that is barks and wood fibres. And happily, we found ourselves on the right side of the environmental debate because we've never used peat. So we supply commercial growers throughout the UK, and since 2014, the retail market with peat-free growing media. I've been involved with the Farm Sphagnum project for the last couple of years or so, and I think we're going to talk a bit more about that now.
So, as you've just said, you're involved as one of the partners in the Innovate UK funded sphagnum farming project, and you were primarily involved in the end product of using this farm sphagnum as a constituent in growing medium. Could you tell us a bit about what you think about the product, which let me just show you quickly. Here is the dried farm sphagnum and processed, so it's all cut up, and that's what we call BeadaGrow. And then here it's mixed as a growing medium with bark in this instance. Right, yeah, over to you. What do you think about it?
Well, right from the start, when we looked at the sphagnum, the farm sphagnum, we could see that it would have great potential. It's got a massive water holding capacity. And the sphagnum, for us, provides an exciting opportunity to provide that moisture holding aspect within the medium. We currently use coir, which is a coconut fibre, which we have to import. It's a very useful, renewable material, but it is imported. And we've done enough in the first round of the project to show that, yes, absolutely, the farm sphagnum can take the place of the coir, and that was a great starting result. So we're very, very interested in it's renewable. We can grow it in the UK. It ticks a lot of boxes. I think it's got much wider potential than just that, but that's where we started. Any growing medium ingredient is useful if it's got very low nutrients and low pH. And this material has both of these things. That presents us as manufacturers with a blank canvas onto which we can impose the nutrient levels and the pH levels that the various applications require. So it ticks those boxes too. Very exciting.
That's great to hear. So how do you see the market in the future for farm sphagnum?
Well, there is a challenge within growing media in the UK at the moment, in as much as still around just over 2 million cubic metres of peat are being used, the majority of which is imported into the UK, but 2 million cubic metres is an awful lot to replace out of a total market of around 4.5 million cubic metres. So just under half is still peat. So there's a long way to go in replacing it. But I think once up and running with efficient economic ways of farming, then the potential is enormous.
And what do you think is needed to achieve the uptake of using farm sphagnum in growing media?
Well, it'll be for us and others like us to demonstrate that it works, but also it's a market that might need a bit of pump priming a bit of help from government, so that farmers can see that it's a really viable option in order to grow sphagnum instead of growing more conventional crops, and that they can do so and get a reasonable return. But other industries have really have to think of wind farming to know that it needed a lot of government incentive to get it going, but it's now showing itself to be viable without that.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much for talking to us today, Catherine. I'm sorry that you couldn't be here in person, but it was great to hear your thoughts on all of this. Great,
Thank you.
you.
Thank you very much.
And so that was Catherine Dawson, the Technical Director of Melcourt Industries, speaking with Jackie Wright from BeadaMoss. So listening to that interview, it seems like there could be potential for wetter farming products in the UK. But the question I want to first put to our panel here is more of a broader brush one, really, about whether wet farming or wetter farming is feasible or desirable at a larger scale in the UK. And so, I mean, I've asked all of you to think about this before coming on to the discussion here. So, Adam, can I come to you first? Obviously, you're representing the people who will be needing to implement this if it's possible, the farmers and landowners. So what's your feeling on that question about whether it's feasible?
Yeah, thanks. There were interesting presentations and an interesting question as well. From a farmer's perspective, I think you need to realise they still see themselves very much as food producers, particularly in the lowlands, and that's the perspective they come at this about. And the knowledge of polluted culture probably isn't there at this moment in time. Their view of water, certainly in the northwest, where it's really wet, is they spend the majority of their time trying to get rid of it to make their land suitable for producing good quality food crops, and that's kind of the perspective they come from. I think sometimes what confuses them as well is just the whole tone of the climate change debate. They're constantly being told that we need to move towards a plant-based diet rather than meat-based diet, and then their perspective, they're saying, well, you know, I'm producing plant-based foods, is that not what I should be doing? And this, you know, politiculture is talking about taking land out of food production and putting it into potentially secondary food production via, say, sphagnum moss, or actually just storing carbon, which takes it away. So saying, well, how does that fit in with the debate where we're told to move towards a more plant-based diet when essentially that's what I'm doing? In terms of does it need looking at, I think definitely yes. I think it will be an opportunity for some farmers. In terms of is it desirable, I think yes, in the right place, it will have its place. I think, is it deliverable? It depends on a number of things. Probably three things are key. The first one is it economically viable? At the end of the day, these are businesses, so there has to be an economic return to those land managers. The second one probably depends on policy steers as well. You know, what sort of messages are we getting from government and also from the supply chain as well. And I think probably it'll increasingly depend on the climate. You know, when the climate changes, the ability to use certain parts of land, that will dictate what land is actually used for. My final point would probably be, you know, everything was new once. Everything farmers do was new once, and farming is an industry, it doesn't change overnight, it takes a while. So, you know, we're very much at the start of a journey, and it'll be interesting to see where it goes.
Okay, thank you. And we've had a lot of really interesting questions in the panel, and I will come to that being put from the audience, but I will come back to those shortly. But Jack, could we just pick up on a couple of things that Adam mentioned there, because your research has been on polluted culture in the UK for a number of years now, and both in your PhD research and in the WaterWorks project, you're looking at different crops, because I was mentioning there that, you know, what crops could be wetter farming crops. You know, if we think about food crops, for example, if farmers are concerned about having to move away from those kind of crops, what would your thoughts be on that about, and in terms of if it's feasible?
Yeah, brilliant, thanks, Sarah. So yeah, I mean, it's really important to kind of get ahead that polluted culture includes a wide variety of crops, so sort of from bioenergy, food for people, fodder for animals, medical crops, as well as a wide range of things. And so we've looked at a large range of a database looking at different plants. So through the WaterWorks project, we're going beyond just sphagnum farming, and we're looking at food crops, so things like watercress, celery, cloudberry, bilberry, water mint. We're looking at a range of sort of biomedical crops as well. So there's things like comfrey, lady smock, yellow flag, which have active ingredients. So I think there's a real range of sort of small niche products that could have quite high value, and a range of broader things, the bioenergy or biomass products that will have a wider market but potentially be lower value. So there's something for everybody, I think, in polluted culture, but just at varying stages of development.
Okay, thank you. I mean, and Tom, obviously you've in more of a policy hat on. You've just completed, well, recently completed one of the Defra peat pilots for Greater Manchester, which also looked into different scenarios for introducing sort of wetter farming, otherwise known as polluted culture. What are your thoughts on picking up on what Adam and Jack have said as well about whether it's feasible and what's right, and you know what's the right place for what?
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. I would really echo what Adam and Jack have said about the kind of, first of all, the importance of the historic use of the land and by those different farming communities, and also that what Jack was saying about how polycultural wet farming isn't this singular product, is a really wide-ranging thing. And the scenarios that we were looking at in the Greater Manchester Peat pilot was kind of trying to incorporate that somewhat, because we looked at the lowland peat mass of Chat Moss, which is the biggest lowland peat mass in Greater Manchester. And depending on the kind of ratio of different polyculture or wet agriculture crops that you're using, you could reduce the emissions on that site by between 50 and 90%, depending on that ratio, and also on the amount of land use change there. So I think it's definitely desirable, because another kind of key finding from that pilot was that across Greater Manchester's lowland peatlands, about 55% of the land is drainage-based agriculture, but that produces about 90% of the emissions. So we have to do something about it, but we can't be under any illusions that this is going to be an overnight change. There are barriers. It's going to need strategic thinking, long-term investment, and long-term cooperation with the landowning community as well.
Okay, Adam, can I bring you back in on that? What do you think to that are the biggest barriers in your mind to introducing it is it you need policy or financial incentives for farmers and landowners? Do you think the biggest stumbling block at the moment?
To be brutally honest, it's probably economics. The fact that you use that land and you get that lowland, tends to be grown high value vegetable and cereal crops, that sort of stuff. The returns on those are great. The margins aren't massive, but it's basically economics. It's the best quality land. It was drained for a reason to produce high value horticultural crops. So if you want to change the perspective, maybe in some areas, maybe the focus is we don't want any more loss. We need to protect what we've got, and then look to other areas where we need to build it back up. But to be brutally honest, it's the opportunity cost of saying, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do this other land use instead. And it's the lack of return to the landowner. I think unfortunately, that's the truth. That's the situation.
And Chris, do you think that the research community also has a role to play here in trying to bridge some of the gaps in knowledge?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I guess how we're going to produce these large-scale reforms that the other guys have talked about, they've got to be evidenced, haven't they? We've got to have an evidence case to take to farmers, but also to take to politicians to support these the massive sort of societal changes that are needed. Really, certainly. I mean, is there a desire for us to change? I think we all reflect on that as a broader society. Probably we need to try and reverse the massive declines in biodiversity that we've observed, particularly over the last 100 years. And we've all accepted that peatlands are huge contributors. We've seen a number of times at this conference to climate change. So I think as a society we need to change, but the desirability for that change is obviously placed on quite a small proportion of society, and that particularly the farmers and landowners. So we need, I guess, a lot of support to try and unpick, I guess, the cultural and economic drivers behind this, and this, to develop the supply chains. There's questions about sort of how we sort of upscale these things. I think they're technically very feasible for us to deliver, but then the issues are very much socioeconomic, I think.
Absolutely. Neal, from your point of view, you're a businessman in essence, what's your thinking on this?
Well, I think picking up on what Alan says, there is a need to look at the economics of this, but there's also a need to do something in terms of lowland peat, partly because of the carbon emissions, but partly because the soil's actually disappearing. There's a need to do something about that, otherwise it's not going to be there anyway. Without some economic livelihood for the farmers, there's obviously what are they going to do? They're either going to be paid to do nothing, or they want to grow an economic crop. And I know most farmers want to grow an economic crop. That's what they're there for, really. They want to farm the land, and they want a crop that they can grow. I think what we've been looking at in terms of sphagnum farming is really to look and see what are the economics of it. Can we do it? Can we do it at scale? Does the product work? And our project has been through all those, and Melcourt have been doing a lot of work on the on whether the product is wanted and what it's worth and whether it does the job that we want it to. And there's a huge demand for it that we seem to have identified. We've got another project going ahead now, just starting for the next 3 years, much more concentrating on the economics and the growing techniques, mechanisation and that sort of thing of the whole system. My view is that there will be a need for some government support, pump priming, to get farmers to change the use of their land into sphagnum farming. There's going to be lots of upfront costs, and it's going to be a 3-year crop, so they're not going to have any income for years. So that needs some support. But in the long run, the economics seem to be there. We've shown that we can produce 1,600 cubic metres of sphagnum off a hectare over 2 years, and the value of that crop would then be £36,000. So you've got a high value crop coming from these peatlands with a huge potential. And obviously there are significant inputs to that, and the details of that is something that we want to work out over the next few years.
Absolutely. And I mean, Jack, your research has looked at multiple crops, potential crops, as well as sphagnum. Do you see there's different crops have financial viability in theory? And I guess with sphagnum moss, it might take a longer to set up, possibly than say other crops. I don't know. What's your feeling on that?
Yeah, so thanks, Sarah. So there's obviously probably the most advanced paludiculture crops are the sort of biomass, bioenergy crops. So things like reed obviously have a long historical use for thatch, which is not the most widely used thing anymore, but there's a huge value in high value construction materials. So you can turn reed into fiberboard, which will go into low carbon homes. So it can kind of feed into this low carbon cradle to cradle type system. Typha as well is very high value. And in terms of the nutrient they strip out of the water, there's again multiple benefits. So you can be paid potentially for storing flood water. You clean that water through your system and then release cleaner water downstream. So it's sort of a multiple benefit approach that will probably lead to overall financial viability for paludiculture.
So we're seeing sort of like a combination of maybe public and private finance. Some might come through the ELMS, the environmental land management schemes, being farmers being paid for climate mitigation or water storage or quality, and there might be also the money from crops, or for example.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we're really seeing the policy support now coming through. So with the lowland England peat strategy, the 25-year environment plan, and then today's CCC carbon budget, they basically acknowledge that there's huge political will to lower carbon emissions through agriculture. And paludiculture definitely, or wetland agriculture definitely has a role to play in that. It's kind of up to us to decide when, where, and at what scale. So it won't be easy, but I'm sure we will get there.
Yeah. Adam, do you think that farmers believe there is policy and financial support? Does it give them confidence to make quite a big change to how they manage the land?
I think it depends on the farm. I think it's easier in the uplands than potentially it is in the lowland sorts of areas. I mean, just picking up on a point about farmers produce food, they do, but they have shown they are willing to do other sorts of things as well. I mean, they grow things like biomass, short rotation, coppice and miscanthus, so they do actually move to produce other crops as well. You've got some farmers farming for biodiversity alongside their agricultural business. I think, again, it all comes down back to economics. The challenge you have is that the economics of farming for food in these lowland peat areas, they're making very, very good money. Traditionally, they don't get any sort of really support from under the current basic payment scheme. They tend not to engage in environmental schemes because it's the opportunity cost of actually going into these schemes is prohibitive for them. But having said that, if all of a sudden a huge wedge of cash came along that said, look, it's going to be more profitable for you to use a chunk of your land to store carbon than actually produce leaks, I think probably they would look at it. that's the top and bottom of it.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Thank you. So I'm going to bring forward some questions that have been put by the audience, so we have some time for that. One question from Clifton Bain. It says, in Germany, golden plover are breeding on the new Sphagnum fields. What wildlife is expected here, and will we need management guidance to help support species on these new habitats? Chris, maybe, is that a question I can put to you? Have you thought in your research capacity about what potential wildlife benefits there might be from various wetter farming crops?
I'll have a go, sir. I measure gas fluxes, but I'll give the biodiversity one a go. I think we'd associate the biodiversity gains with sort of typical wetland species. So remember, one of the big problems we've got in English conservation is the core conservation site is really small and very fragmented. And the point about this sort of shift to polludiculture and wetland farming is that we increase that wetland area, we increase the buffer zones behind it, and we help our conservation sites become more joined up. So I see that wetland farming in general will increase the habitat size for biodiversity, and they will be typical species related to wetlands, like could be waders, bird waders, lizards, some butterflies. We've already seen dragonflies coming in on our carbon farm since we re-wetted it in August. There's also overwintering birds and those sorts of migratory species as well. I guess the second part of that question is, do we need management guidance around that? Then yeah, because clearly if we're going to be harvesting crops, then we really need to think about how we manage, well, water tables and stuff around breeding seasons, how we sort of, we need to maybe avoid key breeding seasons. We also need to avoid perhaps the overwintering season as well. So all those sort of things need to take place, depending on, of course, the focus between biodiversity and production, which I guess is a focus we have to sort of shift between in agriculture in general.
Absolutely, because I suppose that's kind of show a bit of the difference between, I guess, carbon farming and maybe sphagnum farming, other wetter agriculture, where you're harvesting a crop, whereas on carbon farm, which is just a permanent cover crop, there'll be less intensive management. So it might have, different wetter farming will have differing impacts and different things to consider. Jack, is there something that the WaterWorks project is also looking at as well?
Yeah, so not me personally, but they've got a huge network of sort of citizen scientists as well as staff on the Great Fen team who will be monitoring biodiversity. And it's kind of just to echo what Chris was saying, really, is we see it really being a refuge for sort of those wetlands specialists as well as generalists. So you'll certainly see increased bird, invertebrate, and even plant communities coming in. And then I guess in terms of management, sort of a future thought might go around rotational harvest, harvesting at appropriate times. And then I'm not quite sure what happens if we get rare species coming in, but that might be something to consider in the future.
Absolutely, it's a new way of thinking in the UK. So I guess lots of learning will be done along the way at the moment while these pilots are being developed. And next, another question, which is possibly more for Neal, is that, are you using farm scale machinery for your trials? Are you using typical machinery to harvest crops? I guess that'd be Emma Goodyear says that'd be a true test of feasibility of rolling this out at an economically viable scale. So we're thinking about what kind of machinery can be used.
Yeah, I think that this is something that we are addressing in our new project, and actually we've been very recently been doing some trials on some material here on our site, but using agricultural machinery for harvesting, which should prove very successful. I think really our next project is to get the scale up sorted out and how we use current machinery or modified machinery for handling this crop. There's still a lot we don't know, but we do know the crop grows well, and we can grow a high productivity crop. We just need to sort out all the details. So yeah.
Adam, I imagine this would be a question from the farming community as well about, would specialist adapted machinery be required, or that sort of thing? Sort of thinking about the costs.
Yeah, I mean, you know, where there's demand, you tend to find a contractor will go and buy a machine, and all of a sudden he's got a ready-made market. So you tend to find those markets will actually, you know, the machinery and that system, the support system, will actually come along behind it. So yeah, it's a consideration that, you know, you make sure you kit it up and there is the machinery and the support structure in place to harvest and utilize what you've produced on your farm.
Yeah, absolutely. So I imagine there'll be a lot of learning we can have from abroad as well, in Germany and the Netherlands, where this is more developed.
I assume so, to be fair. Sorry, does Neil want to come in there?
Could I just say, in the next project, we are involving farmers in the project specifically because the farmers are the best ones at working out what machinery is needed and how to use it. I don't want to teach them how to do that, but they can work that out very well themselves. And there is a good support system in farming to develop machinery for new crops. They're very good at it.
Absolutely. The next question, and I apologise if I don't pronounce the name properly, it's Renee Kirkfleet-Hermans, and they're asking about greenhouse gas balances. So they ask, and I don't know if this question we can answer completely now, but I'll put it to the panel. They're saying, what is the total greenhouse gas balance over the multiple cropping, growing, harvesting cycles of, for example, carbon farming sites, since you go from a bare to a vegetated site, back to bare, to vegetation, etc. So I guess that's more for actually sphagnum farming rather than carbon farming, where we're not actually harvesting a crop. But Chris, I know you're involved in greenhouse gas monitoring, both for the carbon farm and previously for the the sphagnum farming trials. What's your thoughts on how the greenhouse gas, balance works?
Yeah, well, I mean, firstly, we're not quite at the stage of producing a budget. We know the site. We can turn the site from source to sink relatively quickly, depending on the site we work at. So on sort of lowland bogs, West Manchester, as soon as we get sort of canopy coverage, which is in about 6 months in the particular instance we had, then we actually get net carbon uptake. So we haven't worked the whole balance out yet, and we haven't actually completed a whole growth cycle. So a lot of those are unanswered, but we've taken some biomass measurements, and we're hoping the cycle will be completed next year. As regards emissions from bare peat, emissions from bare peat themselves tends to be quite low. So the actual losses, if we have got a bare period in a cropping cycle, could be reduced, and we can probably work on how we mitigate those through management. But Neal will know more about that as well.
Okay, yeah, I'm afraid we're coming very close to our time up on that. So I think that's quite a big question actually. That and I think the take-home message of that is that we're doing a lot of research. Well, monitoring is being done so we can learn more about the greenhouse gas balances to get an informed decision about what impacts that will have. And we might have time for one very quick question. Does the sphagnum remove any nutrients from the peat, i.e. are harvests limited without fertiliser? At the carbon farm, we're trialling not adding fertiliser and adding fertiliser. Neal, at your sphagnum farm, did you have to add nutrients?
Yes, basically. What we're trying to do is to grow a crop here, so we're inputting what's needed for the plant. So we're irrigating when necessary, and we'll be adding nutrient where necessary. There will be a need to ensure that the crop's growing optimally to get maximum yields.
Okay, so if you needed to crop it, say for a alternative growing medium, etc.
Yeah.
Okay, right. I think I'm going to have to wrap up. What I would like to say is thank you very much to all of you for coming on the panel and answering some of the questions. I'm afraid we weren't able to ask all the questions that came to the audience. If people have any more questions, or there's anything you've seen or heard in the session that you're wondering about, please head over to the exhibition spaces later, and we'll be happy to chat further over some virtual drink and nibbles. But for now, I think we will wrap up this session. Thank you everyone for attending, and yeah, good luck. Bye-bye.
Thank you.